Good morning, ladies. I hope all is well. This week, you have a paper due. That paper is due today by midnight. Hopefully, you've already done it. You don't have any questions about it. I haven't gotten very many emails this weekend about it, so hopefully people have that under control. Turn those in again by midnight. Looking forward to reading those, seeing who you're nominating as the most important person or event in church history. This week, we kind of see a reaction to the Reformation through kind of a counter-Reformation in the Catholic Church. And this kind of begins with the Council of Trent that meets to discuss the complaints of all the reformers. And the Council of Trent was kind of an interesting council because they tried to invite the different leaders of the reform movements to this council. They wanted it to be kind of a, let's sit down, talk this out, work this out, and come back to one unified church. But none of the reformers chose to come, and therefore it just left Catholic priests sitting there to talk about what the reformers were saying. And what they inevitably kind of did at the Council of Trent was reaffirm a lot of what they've already said. I wouldn't say that they changed a ton of things, they more solidified them. For example, they solidified the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. They did fine-tune some things like saying that priests should all go through a seminary and be more well prepared for the priesthood so there are less abuses, like we see with the selling of indulgences. They definitely decried the selling of indulgences. That ended at that point. But they mostly said, you know what, people are complaining that we're being inconsistent, so let's be more consistent. Let's make sure everyone is in line with these solid teachings. And so they really tried to make it a lot more uniform, and by doing that, they made Latin the language of the Mass, and everyone did exactly the same thing, said exactly the same thing. Even with the Sacrament of Reconciliation, they kind of fine-tuned it where there were these penitential books that priests would look at, so they were giving the same penances to people when they confessed their sins. So they just really wanted to be really uniform, because I think in the Reformation, they were being criticized as being inconsistent about certain things, okay? So, again, the Council of Trent just reaffirmed more things than it changed, and it did change a couple of things, like saying no more selling of indulgences, and let's make sure priests are more well prepared for this role. Another thing that kind of gets more firmly established around this time is the College of Cardinals. This is a group of people whose job it is to kind of take over when the Pope dies, or as we saw in the last 20 years, resign, which hardly ever happens. And so the College of Cardinals became kind of a group of people who had a lot of, say in the church. They could affect the policies and the teachings, the doctrines of the church. But they also step in if a pope dies, and they're the people who pick the next pope. And it's almost always someone from the College of Cardinals that is selected to be the next pope. And when a pope dies, the College of Cardinals convenes, and they meet and they pray and they discuss who could be the best candidate, and they vote. And they vote many times. For sometimes it's been up to years that they're voting on this. And basically, they'll hold a vote, and if it is not enough of a majority of people who've agreed, then they burn the pieces of paper, and black smoke comes out of the Sistine Chapel's, fireplace. If they vote and they agree, or they come to enough of a consensus about this, then they burn the voting papers, and white smoke comes out of the Sistine Chapel chimney. And then everyone in the world knows they've selected a pope. And as we saw the last, 5 years ago when they were selecting a pope, everyone convenes in St. Peter's Square, and they await this white smoke. And it's a huge deal when they pick a next pope. And hopefully we won't pick a new pope for a long time, because I love Pope Francis and all that he's doing, and, like to see him in that position for a long time. But as you can imagine, from kind of a more political point of view, a pope then has in his best interest the job of appointing people to be cardinals. And so a pope will try to appoint people who are like-minded, so that when they do die, that the deck is kind of stacked, and they will end up with someone who thinks like they do. So I haven't really noticed a lot of people being appointed cardinals, but that is something that does happen a lot with papacies. You see in this week's reading a lot of new religious orders developing, and kind of, this argument between logic and reason versus religion and science and spirituality. And you'll read about several mystics. These are people who had these very mystical experiences, maybe kind of like outer body experiences or moments where they really felt a connection with God, or where they go into almost like a trance-like state. And they've had visions of Jesus and Mary in these moments also. And so these are, kind of the opposite of this idea of enlightenment or scholasticism that we've talked about, okay? And so their idea of faith is that it's all something that you feel, that is emotional, that you experience. And so that's kind of a new twist. Also, we see a lot of missionary work. There's a lot of people who are now traveling because they can. Keep in mind that being able to read the Bible and the kind of open, free thinking that happened with the Reformation affected a lot of people. And this idea of individualism, nominalism, that you see also in your reading, kind of is affecting people as they move forward. And so now that they're more well educated, they want to spread the word about Jesus to other people. So you'll see or read about several missionary work, people doing missionary work. One story I wanted to touch on was the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe, because this is pretty important in this era. This was in Mexico, where there were still a lot of Aztec people. And Juan Diego was walking one day, and he had a vision of Our Lady. And Our Lady told him that he needed to tell the bishop to build a church. So he keeps going to the bishop. The bishop doesn't believe him. Meanwhile, his uncle gets very sick, so he misses a meeting with Mary. And then Mary stops him along the road and tells him his uncle is healed and that he needs to keep coming to this spot. He goes home and finds that his uncle is 100% better. So he keeps going to see Mary. And the bishop has asked for a sign. So Mary says to Juan Diego, "Here's roses. It's the middle of winter. Roses don't usually grow. Pick up these roses, put them inside your tilma or your cloak. And when you get to the bishop, open up your cloak, and he'll see that roses grew in the winter, and this will be his sign." So Juan Diego does exactly as Mary instructed. And when he gets to the bishop, he opens up his cloak. All the roses fall, but on the inside of his cloak is this perfect imprint of Our Lady that no one can explain. It still exists. The cloth itself has never, the image has never deteriorated from this cloth. And if you look closely at the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, it looks as though Our Lady is pregnant too. And so this ultimately led to the total conversion of the people of Mexico, to the point where today, if you go to Mexico or really any Spanish-speaking country, you find that 98% of the people are Catholic, and they have a real devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. As we read about the missionary work, we hear about some abuses of missionary work, and this isn't really in your reading, but just keep in mind that the people who were indigenous to the area weren't necessarily welcoming these missionary people in the beginning. They had new ideas. They brought with them diseases. The people had no immunity built up to these illnesses, so it led to a lot of people dying. And in some cases, people were really pretty forceful as they passed on this idea of Christianity. This is not what missionary work is like today at all, but at the time they were conquering these people and then kind of imposing their faith on them. And eventually the people did believe, and it's a great faith, Christianity, Jesus' message, but I'm just saying that in the history there are some abuses of this as well. Some of this individualism led to some skepticism with the church and people kind of pulling away from the church. We also see some advances in science. Specifically, you'll read about some advances in the field of psychology with Freud, and some new ideas about the world and how it's formed and shaped and how we fit into the creation of God. And so these new scientific ideas really rocked the church too, because they really called into question some of the ideas of the church. So that's what you'll read about this week. Also, Karl Marx enters the fray after the Industrial Revolution has began, and the workers are working these crazy hours and in terrible conditions. And so Karl Marx writes about that in the Communist Manifesto. And in the next week's reading, you'll see a church response to that. You guys have a great week.